I never imagined that the people I had sacrificed everything for, the ones I stayed awake for at night, prayed for every morning, and shielded from every shadow life ever cast, would one day look at me as if I were nothing more than a weight tied to their ankles. It didn't happen suddenly. It wasn't like one moment we were a family and the next moment I became invisible. No, it was slow. It was gradual. It was the kind of slow heartbreak that doesn't make noise, doesn't draw attention, and doesn't allow you to even pinpoint the exact moment it began. I only remember that one day I woke up and realized I wasn't part of their conversations anymore. I wasn't part of their decisions. I wasn't even part of their worries. I was simply there. Like furniture. Like a forgotten photograph collecting dust in the corner. And the irony was that I had built my entire life around them. Every choice I made for them. Every dream I shelved for them. Every tear I hid so they wouldn't worry. But the more I gave, the less they seemed to remember the woman behind the sacrifices. It started becoming clear during the evenings when the house would fill with laughter. My daughter's laughter, her husband's voice, the sound of their new routines, their jokes, but none of it was meant for me. I would sit in the living room, my hands resting helplessly on my lap, while their conversations floated around me like smoke I couldn't hold. Sometimes they talked about dinner plans, sometimes vacations they wanted to take, sometimes something funny from work. But never about me. Never to me. And I watched them with the quiet ache of someone who knew she no longer had a place in the world she spent decades building. I remember once thinking that maybe I was just being emotional, maybe they were simply tired, maybe life was just busy. But people who love you don't forget to love you no matter how busy life becomes. What hurt even more was the subtle shift in their tone. The softness with which my daughter once spoke to me was gone. She used to hold my hand just to feel my presence. Now she handed me things like she didn't want our fingers to touch. She used to ask me how I was feeling, but now she asked me things like, "You need anything?" The way someone asks about a broken appliance. And her husband, he had always been respectful, but lately his eyes carried a silent irritation, as if my breathing itself made the air heavier. Every sigh, every step, every request from me felt like it inconvenienced him. They didn't say anything cruel directly, not at first, but their looks, their silence, their whispers behind half-closed doors, those were louder than words could ever be. It all reached a point where I began to avoid speaking altogether. When you feel unwanted long enough, you start shrinking yourself. You start moving quietly, eating quietly, existing quietly, hoping that maybe if they don't notice your presence, they won't get frustrated with you. I stopped sitting in the living room and spent most of my hours in the small guest room they had given me, staring at the wall and wondering when exactly life had taken such a turn. The pictures on my phone, old photos of birthdays, school events, family dinners, felt like memories belonging to someone else, someone who had once been loved and needed. I looked at those photos and wondered whether that version of me had disappeared, or whether she still lived somewhere inside, buried under the weight of years of exhaustion and silent heartbreak. But the real sting, the real moment that split me open, came one evening when I overheard them talking. They didn't know I was awake. They didn't know I could hear through the thin walls. And they didn't know that their words would carve themselves into me permanently. My daughter whispered in a voice full of frustration, "I don't know how long we can keep doing this. She's just too much." Her husband replied, "She's dead weight, babe. She's slowing everything down. We can't plan anything. We can't breathe. Dead weight." The words hit me like a blow to the chest. I felt my breath leave my body, as if someone had knocked the air out of me. I wanted to believe I had heard wrong, but the tone in his voice left no room for doubt. To them, I wasn't a mother. I wasn't the woman who once carried her daughter through storms, who fed her when she had nothing, who loved her through every mistake. To them, I was a burden, a responsibility they wished they didn't have. I lay there that night staring at the ceiling, unable to cry because the pain was too deep for tears. I felt something inside me collapse, a quiet collapse, the kind no one hears, the kind no one notices. And in that moment I realized something I was never ready to accept. You can give someone your entire life and still end up unwanted in theirs. The next morning arrived not with the calm glow of a new day, but with the heaviness of a truth I wasn't ready to face. I woke slowly, as if my body itself was resisting consciousness, knowing that rising meant returning to a world where I no longer felt welcome. The muted sounds of life drifted through the thin walls. Dishes clinking, the buzzing of the electric kettle, the low murmur of my daughter and her husband speaking in tones too hushed for comfort yet loud enough for the heart to catch their intent. I sat there on the corner of the bed, hands resting on my knees, staring at the floor as if it might offer some explanation for the shift in my life. I could hear my daughter laughing faintly at something her husband said. A soft, careless laughter that once filled the home when I was the center of her little world. Now it felt like a wall between us. The painful part wasn't that they were happy. The painful part was knowing they could be happy without me. I forced myself to stand, my joints protesting not out of age but out of emotional exhaustion, and opened the door to step into a kitchen that no longer felt like mine. They stopped talking the moment I entered, their silence sharp and immediate, like a door being slammed in my face without physically closing. My daughter turned, plastering a polite smile on her face, one of those smiles she gives strangers out of courtesy, not love, and asked if I slept well. I nodded even though I had barely slept at all. Her husband barely lifted his eyes from his phone as he muttered a greeting that felt more like an obligation than a welcome. I wanted to ask if everything was okay, if I had done something wrong, if maybe there was a discussion I should be part of. But the words clung to my throat, refusing to escape. I had once been bold, expressive, warm. Now around them I felt like a shadow learning to speak again. So I sat quietly at the edge of the table, folding my hands in my lap, trying not to make any unnecessary movement they might find inconvenient. The silence around us grew thick, almost suffocating, until my daughter broke it by placing a cup of tea in front of me, not with the gentle touch she once had, but with a quick, almost mechanical gesture. It was such a small thing, barely noticeable to anyone else, but when love fades, even small gestures become loud. I reached for the cup, my fingers trembling slightly, and saw my son-in-law glance at me with an expression I couldn't fully decipher. Frustration, impatience, or perhaps guilt trying to disguise itself. Whatever it wasn't kindness. And for the first time in my life, I felt the sting of realizing that kindness from the people you love is not a guarantee. It is a choice they must continue to make, and sometimes they simply stop choosing it. As the day went on, I tried to keep myself busy. I folded blankets they had already folded, wiped counters that didn't need wiping, rearranged small things that hadn't been out of place to begin with, anything to keep from feeling useless. That's the cruelest part of growing old, I think. You begin to chase purpose not because you lack it, but because the people around you convince you that you no longer hold any. I thought maybe if I helped around the house they might soften. Maybe if I made myself useful they would see me again. But every time I stepped into a room they walked out. Every time I offered to help, they waved me off with polite but dismissive tones. Every time I tried to start a conversation, it ended in seconds, leaving me with half-spoken words swallowed back into silence. By afternoon I found myself sitting alone on the back porch, staring at the yard where I once watched my daughter play as a child. I remembered the way her tiny hands would reach for mine, not out of obligation but out of pure trust. How did we get here? How does a bond once stronger than time become so fragile that a few whispered complaints could shatter it? I wrapped my arms around myself as the breeze brushed past, bringing with it the faint sound of my daughter and her husband laughing inside. It wasn't the laughter that hurt. It was knowing I wasn't part of the life behind it. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath, but the memory of last night's words echoed again, dead weight, and I felt my chest tighten. It's a strange kind of pain. The kind that comes from realizing you've become an inconvenience to the people you raised with your own trembling hands. I sat there for a long time, long enough for the sun to shift and cast my shadow across the porch like a reminder of how easily shadows fade when the light moves. Eventually, my daughter stepped outside, phone in her hand, not seeing me at first. When she finally noticed me, she forced another smile, asking if I needed something. I shook my head, but inside I wanted to tell her that I didn't need things. I needed her. I needed her to look at me the way she once did. I needed to feel like a mother again, not a guest overstaying her welcome. As the sky dimmed into evening, I slowly returned to my room, closing the door behind me with a quiet finality. I sat on the bed, letting the day's heaviness settle. And in that heavy silence, one thought kept pulsing through my mind. If love can fade so silently, what will become of me when it disappears entirely? That night, after another day of quiet avoidance and hollow politeness, I found myself lying awake again, my thoughts spiraling into places I didn't want them to go. The room felt smaller than before, as if the walls had shifted inward, mimicking the shrinking space I occupied in my daughter's life. The soft glow from the hallway slipped under the door, casting a faint line of light across the floor, and I watched it for what felt like hours, wondering how a home once filled with my laughter, my guidance, my strength had now reduced me to someone who tiptoed around like an uninvited guest. I pressed my hand against my chest as if holding myself together, because the pain, this emotional, invisible kind, felt like it might open me in places that would never heal. The quiet of the house was deceptive. Beneath it lay the tension of unspoken truths, of wishes they didn't dare voice in front of me. And in that suffocating silence, memories came uninvited. I remembered the night my daughter cried in my arms after her first heartbreak. I remembered how she clutched me like I was the only safe place in her world. Who was that girl? Where had she gone? When did her eyes stop searching for me? When did her arms stop reaching for mine? I felt a tear slip down my cheek, and I let it fall because for once I was too tired to hide my hurt from myself. I don't know when I drifted into sleep, but I woke suddenly to the sound of voices, my daughter and her husband again. This time in the hallway, their tones sharper, less restrained, as if they assumed I couldn't hear. My heart thudded painfully as I strained to make out the words. "We can't keep living like this," he said, his frustration cracking through every syllable. "She needs too much attention. It's affecting everything." My daughter whispered back, her voice shaking just enough for me to feel hope and despair simultaneously. "I know, but she's my mother." A heavy silence followed. Then he said the words that sliced through me more deeply than anything before. "You're letting guilt run your life. She's slowing us down. She's draining. Draining." The word echoed in my mind like a cruel chant. I felt my breath catch, my hands trembling as I clutched the blanket. To be seen not as a human being, but as a drain on someone's life. How does a mother survive that realization? I wanted to believe he was angry, that he didn't mean it, but the calm firmness in his voice told me he meant every word. And what hurt most wasn't his judgment, it was my daughter's silence. She didn't defend me. She didn't correct him. She didn't say, "Don't speak about my mother like that." She just let the words hang there. Let them become truths by allowing them to remain unchallenged. The next morning, everything felt different. The air itself seemed heavier, the rooms colder, the sounds sharper. I moved through the house quietly, feeling like a ghost drifting through spaces that no longer belonged to me. My daughter greeted me with the same polite smile, but now I could see the exhaustion behind it, an exhaustion I had become the cause of. Her husband barely acknowledged me, his eyes skimming past me like I was an object blocking his path instead of a person who raised the woman he loved. I made myself small, almost invisible, speaking only when necessary, because I didn't want to trigger another whispered conversation about how burdensome I was becoming. That's what happens when love is replaced by obligation. You start shrinking, minimizing yourself, trying to take up less and less space until maybe, just maybe, they forget you're even there. Later in the afternoon, I heard them arguing quietly. Not yelling. Just tense, controlled voices filled with the weight of decisions they didn't want to face. "We can't afford this emotionally," he said. "And honestly, maybe she'd be better somewhere else." Somewhere else. The phrase struck me like cold water. Was I really at a point where my own child was considering sending me away? I leaned against the wall, my knees weak, tears gathering in my eyes as I realized that the home I had imagined spending my last years in, the home where I hoped to feel warmth, love, and closeness, was no longer mine. It had never been mine. I was a visitor overstaying a silent deadline they had already set. My daughter didn't reply immediately. I heard her breathing, soft and uneven. She has nowhere else. She whispered eventually. She's my mother. But even in that whisper, I felt the hesitation, the uncertainty, the struggle inside her. And that hurt more than if she had outright agreed with him. I walked to the porch to breathe, my hands shaking as I leaned on the railing. The outside world felt peaceful. The rustling leaves, the distant hum of cars, the golden evening light filtering through the trees, but inside me a storm raged. I stared at the yard, remembering the times I held my daughter's hands as she learned to walk, the times we planted flowers together, the times she looked up at me like I was the center of her universe. How did that little girl grow into a woman who saw me as a weight she didn't know how to carry? I felt myself breaking again. Not the loud, dramatic kind of breaking, but the silent, slow, devastating kind. The kind no one notices because it happens quietly. In moments when you're alone. In places where your tears become just another part of the afternoon breeze. When I finally returned inside, neither of them acknowledged me. They were on the couch, scrolling through their phones, living lives in which I no longer had a place. I went back to my room, closing the door gently so they wouldn't accuse me of making noise. I sat on the edge of the bed, my heart heavy, my mind spinning. And in that suffocating loneliness, another painful truth settled in my chest. It's not always death that ends relationships. Sometimes it's neglect. Sometimes it's silence. Sometimes it's simply forgetting to love. The next few days unfolded like a slow, painful unraveling, each moment tugging at a thread I had spent my whole life weaving. I tried to convince myself that things would get better, that maybe I was being too sensitive, too emotional, too aware. But deep inside I knew I wasn't imagining anything. The distance between us wasn't temporary. It was growing like a quiet storm spreading across a once clear sky. Every morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest, hoping, begging silently, that today would be different. That my daughter would look at me the way she used to. That her husband would talk to me with the basic warmth he once had. But when I stepped into the kitchen, I always found the same thing. Cold greetings, empty smiles, conversations that stopped when I entered, and that tired, burdened look in their eyes that told me they were counting the days until something changed. And deep down, I knew what that something was supposed to be: me leaving. One afternoon, I was sitting quietly on the sofa, watching the dust particles dance in the sunlight, trying not to exist too loudly, when my daughter sat down across from me. She hesitated, twisting her fingers around themselves the way she used to when she had done something wrong as a child. For a moment my heart leapt, thinking she might finally talk to me, open her heart, tell me she still needed me. But instead she asked something that froze my blood. "Mom, have you ever thought about other living arrangements?" My breath caught halfway, suspended in my chest like a stone refusing to fall. I stared at her, unsure if I had heard correctly. "Other living arrangements?" I repeated softly, my voice trembling not with anger but with disbelief. She looked away, unable to meet my eyes. Just as an idea. You know, somewhere you might feel more comfortable. Less dependent on us. Somewhere with professional care. She said it gently, carefully, but each word landed like a blade on my heart. I had expected distance. I had expected tension. But I wasn't prepared to be pushed away. Not by the child I had poured my entire soul into. Not by the girl whose tiny hands once held my face as if I were her entire world. I felt my breath shaking as I shifted in my seat, trying to gather myself, trying to keep the hurt from spilling into my voice. "Do you want me to leave?" I asked quietly. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath and said, "Mom, it's not about wanting anything. It's about what's practical. You need things we're struggling to provide. It's hard to balance everything. Practical. Struggling. Hard to balance." Words that sound so reasonable, so harmless, until you realize they're being used to justify pushing you out of a life you once built with your bare hands. I nodded slowly, unable to trust my voice. If I spoke, I feared I would break so loudly they would hear the pieces fall. My daughter stood up quickly, as if relieved the conversation was over and she could escape. "Just think about it, okay? No pressure." And then she walked away, leaving me sitting in the same spot, staring at the same dancing dust, but now seeing nothing. That night I couldn't sleep. Every memory felt like a weight pressing down on me. Memories of every sacrifice, every hardship I endured so she could grow. I remembered working 2 jobs when she was young, my hands cracking from cold air and harsh detergents, yet still smiling when I tucked her into bed. I remembered skipping meals so she could eat. I remembered walking miles to get her medicine when she was sick. My legs shaking from exhaustion but my heart strong with love. I remembered holding her when she cried, standing up for her when the world seemed too unfair, celebrating her victories as if they were my own. I remembered raising her alone for years, fighting battles no one saw, surviving storms I never told her about. And now, after all of it, it had come to this, being asked gently yet firmly to consider leaving her home. The next morning I moved slower than usual, each step feeling like it belonged to someone much older. My daughter didn't mention our conversation from the day before, but she didn't have to. Her silence said enough. Her husband barely looked at me, and when he did, his eyes carried a strange kind of relief, as if a burden had shifted and he could finally breathe. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to feel rage so powerful it might protect me. But all I felt was sorrow. A deep, dull sorrow that wrapped itself around my bones and refused to let go. Later that afternoon, my daughter approached me again, this time holding a brochure. A brochure. She handed it to me with that same strained smile. "Just some options," she said softly. "Places where you would get a lot of support." I stared at the glossy photos of smiling elderly people in bright rooms, pretending they were happy, pretending they weren't placed there by children who no longer had room in their lives for them. My hands trembled as I held the brochure. I felt humiliated. I felt abandoned. But above all, I felt replaceable for the first time in my life. The woman who once held her world together was now being gently guided out of it, like someone being escorted out of a party they no longer belonged in. I looked at my daughter and for a moment her eyes met mine. I searched for the little girl I had raised, the girl who once believed I could fix anything, the girl who clung to me whenever she felt afraid. But instead, I saw a woman burdened by responsibility, by expectation, by a husband who didn't want me there. And in her eyes I saw something that broke me completely. Not hatred, not anger, but relief masked as concern. She wanted me to say yes. She wanted me to leave so she could have her life back. And for the first time in days I realized something painful but true. I wasn't being pushed away because they didn't love me. I was being pushed away because they loved their comfort more. The following days felt like walking through a dream you desperately want to wake up from. Yet every morning proves it isn't a dream at all. My daughter began treating me with a strange over-politeness, soft, careful words spoken the way you speak to a stranger whose feelings you don't want to hurt. Not because you care, but because you fear looking cruel. Her husband, on the other hand, stopped pretending altogether. The impatience in his sighs, the stiff way he moved around me, the quiet conversations he tried to mask with laughter whenever I walked into a room, all of it made the truth clearer than words ever could. I was no longer part of this home. I was a temporary presence being softly nudged toward the exit. And the worst part? They were doing it gently, thinking that softness somehow erased the abandonment. But abandonment is abandonment, whether shouted or whispered. One evening, as I sat alone at the dining table with a warm cup of tea cooling in my hands, I overheard them again from the hallway. "We need to make a decision," he said, his voice slightly raised. "It's affecting us. The tension, the stress, everything." My daughter murmured something too soft for me to hear. Then he added, "This is not sustainable." That word, sustainable, stung me with a kind of humiliation I didn't know words could cause. I was no longer a mother. I was no longer a loved one. I was a problem to be solved, a situation to be managed, a weight to be lifted off their shoulders. I closed my eyes, tears slipping silently down my face, and wondered how the years of love, sacrifice, and devotion had turned into such cold calculation. The people I had nurtured into their adult lives now saw me as an inconvenience. And sitting there in the dim glow of the kitchen light, I realized something that hollowed me to my core. Love doesn't disappear overnight. It erodes slowly while you aren't looking. The next morning, I woke with the determination I hadn't felt in days. Not the determination to fight or argue, no, something far quieter. It was the determination of someone who has accepted that they can't force love where it no longer wants to stay. I dressed slowly, my hands moving with a kind of careful sadness, and stepped into the living room. They were both there, whispering again. When they saw me, their conversation died instantly, replaced with awkward smiles. My daughter asked if I wanted breakfast, her tone too eager, too light, an attempt to cover the heaviness she knew I had sensed. I nodded and sat down, watching her move around the kitchen with a certain nervous efficiency, as if serving me quickly would ease her guilt. Her husband avoided my gaze entirely, choosing instead to scroll through his phone with forced focus. The air between us felt thick, suffocating, as though we were all holding our breaths, waiting for a moment none of us wanted to acknowledge. After we ate, my daughter gently touched my hand. "Mom, can we talk?" she asked. Her eyes were soft but carried something else too, fear, maybe shame. She led me to the couch, sitting beside me the way she used to when she wanted comfort as a child. But now her posture was tense, unsure. "I've been thinking about what I mentioned the other day," she began quietly. "About other living arrangements." My heart tightened, but I kept my face still. I didn't want to make her feel worse. She took a deep breath. "There's a place not far from here. It's really nice. Friendly staff. Clean. Safe. They have activities, a garden, and people your age that you can talk to." She paused, searching my eyes for an emotion I refused to show. "You wouldn't feel alone," she added softly, as if that would somehow soften the blow. I wanted to ask her how she could say that, not feel alone, when leaving me in such a place was the loneliest thing she could ever do. But I remained quiet. Her husband joined us, standing behind her with his arms crossed. "It's the best option," he said, his voice firm, final. He wasn't asking. He was telling. And in that moment I saw the real truth. This wasn't my daughter's decision. It was his. He wanted me gone. I looked at my daughter, hoping, desperately hoping, to see even a flicker of resistance in her eyes. But all I found was resignation. She wasn't choosing this because she stopped loving me. She was choosing this because she loved him more. And that realization broke me in a way even their harshest words never could. I felt my throat tighten as I finally spoke. "If this is what you want," I whispered, my voice barely audible, "I'll go." My daughter's face crumpled, a mixture of guilt and relief flashing through her. Her husband exhaled quietly, as if a burden had just lifted from his shoulders. And that silent sigh hurt more than anything else in the world. They didn't hug me. They didn't sit beside me. They simply nodded, as though we had just finished discussing something practical, like rearranging furniture or planning a shopping list. My daughter tried to smile, but it faltered halfway. "It's going to be good for you, Mom," she said softly. "You'll be around people. You'll have support." Support. The word echoed painfully inside my chest. Where had their support gone? When did my need for comfort become a burden? When did the hands I used to hold so tightly let go of mine? That night I stayed awake again, but this time I didn't cry. There were no tears left. Only an empty ache, vast and silent. I looked around the small room, the walls bare, the shelves empty except for a few of my belongings, and realized how quickly a home can stop feeling like one. I thought about leaving, about what waited for me in that nice place with friendly staff and scheduled activities. But what haunted me wasn't the idea of going. It was the realization that they wanted me gone more than they wanted me to stay. And with that truth carving itself deeper into me, I lay down, closed my eyes, and whispered into the darkness. Maybe leaving isn't the worst part. Maybe the worst part is knowing no one will miss me when I'm gone. The morning of the move came faster than I expected, as if time itself had conspired to push me out before I had fully processed what was happening. I woke up before dawn, sitting on the edge of the bed with my suitcase half open beside me, its emptiness staring back at me like a reminder of how small my life had shrunk, How little I was allowed to take from a home I once believed I would never have to leave. My fingers brushed over the few belongings laid out. A faded shawl my mother had embroidered decades ago. An old photo of my daughter as a child with her arms wrapped around my neck, and a small silver bracelet she had gifted me on her 12th birthday. I hesitated before picking it up. It felt strange to pack memories into a bag, as if I was tucking away pieces of myself that no one in the house cared to remember anymore. I closed the suitcase slowly, careful not to make noise. It had become a habit now, moving like a whisper, existing like a shadow. From the hallway I heard soft footsteps and muffled voices. My daughter and her husband were awake, speaking in low tones as if discussing a delicate secret. Their whispers had been my reality for weeks, whispers that decided my fate long before I had a chance to understand it. I took a deep breath, swallowed the tightness in my throat, and walked out of the room. They both looked startled when they saw me dressed and ready. My daughter forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes, while her husband offered a stiff nod. The silence settled between us like an unwanted guest. My daughter approached me, her hands fidgeting, her voice soft. "Mom, are you sure you didn't want breakfast?" I shook my head gently. "I'm fine." But fine was far from the truth. Inside, I felt like a fragile glass sculpture moments away from shattering, but I refused to break in front of them, not today. She nodded and looked down, guilt flickering across her expression before disappearing as quickly as it came. Her husband grabbed the keys and cleared his throat. "We should leave soon," he said, almost too quickly, too eagerly. He wanted this over with. He wanted the burden gone. And I wanted this moment to last just a little longer. Even if it hurt, because it was the last morning I would ever spend in the home I thought would be my refuge. As we stepped outside, the cold air stung my face, waking my senses enough to feel the heaviness of the moment. The sky was pale, painted with the soft colors of early dawn, as if the world outside was beginning fresh while my world inside was falling apart. My daughter walked beside me, but her steps felt distant, disconnected, like she was walking next to a stranger instead of the woman who had raised her. Her husband walked ahead, unlocking the car, loading my suitcase into the trunk without a second glance. I stood there for a moment looking at the house, the windows, the porch, the doorway where I once welcomed my daughter home from school, where I once hugged her tightly after her first heartbreak, where I stood proud the day she graduated. Every memory lived in those walls, yet now those walls felt unfamiliar, cold, as if they had been trained to forget me. The car ride was quiet, too quiet. My daughter kept glancing at me, her eyes full of something she didn't know how to express. Guilt? Regret? Or the uncomfortable relief of someone fulfilling a responsibility they didn't want. She reached for the temperature dial as if adjusting the air would somehow ease the tension choking the space between us. Her husband drove with steady focus, eyes fixed on the road, tapping his fingers on the steering wheel in a rhythm that felt like impatience. Cars passed by, people moved about, unaware that inside this small car, a mother's heart was quietly breaking in ways she would never recover from. After what felt like an eternity, we reached the building. It stood tall, clean, polished, designed to look welcoming, comforting, as if it could hide what it truly was. A place for people the world no longer had room for. People whose presence became a burden. People who once held families together, but were now gently pushed aside so lives could continue without them. My daughter stepped out first, walking around to help me, while her husband retrieved the suitcase. The staff inside greeted us warmly, with practiced smiles and soothing voices. But kindness from strangers couldn't soothe the pain of abandonment. They spoke to my daughter more than they spoke to me, asking questions, explaining procedures, giving reassuring lines they probably spoke 100 times a day. I sat in a soft armchair while the paperwork was completed, my hands folded in my lap, feeling strangely small. Around me, other elderly faces watched, some with resignation, some with longing, some with hollow eyes that recognized the same story in mine. I wondered how many of them were brought here with the same soft betrayal, the same quiet push from the people they once loved more than life itself. When everything was finally done, my daughter walked toward me. For a moment, a brief, flickering moment, I thought she might cry. I thought she might take my hands and tell me she didn't want me to stay, that she didn't want to leave me here. But instead she hugged me gently, carefully, the way people hug someone fragile. "Mom, please understand," she whispered. "We're doing what's best." Best. Another word that cuts differently each time it's spoken. She stepped back, wiping an invisible tear that didn't fall. Her husband placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her toward the exit. I watched them walk away together without looking back. I remained seated, my body still, my eyes fixed on the door long after it closed behind them. And in that moment, sitting alone in a place meant for people forgotten by the world, a truth settled deep within me. Children grow up believing their parents will never leave them. Parents grow old realizing their children eventually will. My first night in that place, what they called a residence, but felt more like a waiting room between life and forgetting, was one of the loneliest nights I had ever lived. The room was clean, too clean, sterile in a way that made it feel empty of memories, empty of presence, empty of anything resembling a home. I sat on the single narrow bed, my suitcase open at my feet, the few belongings I brought scattered around like pieces of a life that no longer had a place to settle. The hallway outside echoed with soft footsteps and distant murmurs, voices of strangers trying to navigate their own heartbreaks, their own abandonments. I could hear a woman crying in the next room, softly, muffled, the way someone cries who has learned that tears earn no comfort. I knew that sound too well. I knew the weight behind it. As I sat there, listening to the unfamiliar symphony of loneliness around me, I felt myself sinking into a sadness so deep that even breathing felt like a burden. I wondered what my daughter was doing at that moment. Was she relieved? Was she laughing with her husband? Was she sleeping peacefully without the fear of whether I might need something? I imagined her home, warm and full of life, the place I once belonged to now moving on without me. Every object in the room seemed to stare back at me, reminding me that this was where I was expected to spend the rest of my days. A room that wasn't chosen but assigned. A place that wasn't home but storage. I walked toward the small window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to see the outside. The night sky stretched over the world in its usual indifference, stars blinking as if whispering stories of people forgotten by those they once nurtured. The streetlights cast long shadows across the parking lot, and for a moment, I felt like one of those shadows, present but unnoticed. I pressed my hand against the cold glass and imagined my daughter's hand in mine the way it used to be when she was little. How tightly she used to hold me. How desperately she clung to me whenever she felt scared. Now I was the one clinging to memories of her, gripping them as though they might somehow bring her back to me. Bring us back to a time when love was simple and I was still needed. A soft knock on my door startled me out of my thoughts. A nurse entered, her smile warm, her eyes kind in a way that felt almost foreign after weeks of coldness at home. She asked if I needed anything: water, blankets, medication. Her voice was gentle, practiced, but still sincere enough to touch a part of me I thought had gone numb. I shook my head politely, thanking her. As she left, I realized that kindness from strangers can sometimes feel sharper than cruelty from the people you love, because it reminds you that love, when given freely, should feel like this. It should feel comforting, safe. But what I had felt at home was the complete opposite. I sat back down on the bed, suddenly exhausted, not by age but by life itself. I lay back slowly, staring at the ceiling with its faint cracks forming delicate patterns that reminded me of all the scars inside me that no one bothered to see. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my daughter's face. Not the adult she had become, but the little girl she once was. The girl who used to run to me with open arms. The girl who cried into my chest when she couldn't sleep. The girl who believed I could fix anything just by being there. Where had that girl gone? Where had the years gone? And when did the distance between us grow so wide that she could stand there, watching me leave without falling apart? My heart tightened painfully as I wondered something I had never allowed myself to wonder before. Was I a good mother? Had I done enough? Had I loved her too much? Or not enough? Had I raised her to be strong? Or had I unintentionally raised someone who didn't know how to care for the person who cared for her the most? The questions spiraled through my mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. But somewhere deep inside, a quiet voice, one that had survived every sacrifice, every hardship, whispered that I had done my best, that motherhood is not a contract. It's a gift. And sometimes, even when you give everything, you are still left behind. Eventually, exhaustion overcame my thoughts and I slipped into a restless sleep. I dreamed of my daughter as a child, laughing, running, reaching for me. But the moment I reached back, she faded. My hand passed through her like mist, leaving me grasping at nothing. I woke with tears on my face, the ache in my chest sharper than ever. Morning light began to seep into the room, painting the walls in shades of pale yellow. But instead of warmth, it brought the cold reminder of reality. I was here, alone, and this was my life now. As I sat up, adjusting the blanket around my shoulders, I felt the weight of something I had never felt before. Not just sadness, not just loneliness, but a deep, quiet acceptance. Acceptance that things would never return to what they once were. Acceptance that my daughter had made her choice. Acceptance that love can sometimes fail, not because it was weak, but because people change. And perhaps the most painful acceptance of all, I was not going home again. Still, somewhere within me, a faint spark remained. A spark that whispered that even in places where people are left, forgotten, tucked away, humanity could still survive. Maybe here, among these silent rooms and fragile hearts, I would find people who understood this kind of pain. People who knew what it felt like to be loved once, and then slowly pushed aside. Maybe, just maybe, I would learn to piece together a life again, not the life I lost, but the life I had left. And as I sat there, letting the morning settle around me, I whispered to myself the only truth I still believed. They may have left me, but I am still here. Days turned into weeks inside that quiet building, and slowly, the routine of the place began weaving itself into my life. Not because it felt like home, but because it was the only rhythm I had left to follow. Every morning, I woke to the faint sound of footsteps passing through the hallway, and the distant clatter of breakfast trays being pushed on metal carts. The same nurse who had greeted me on the first night often checked on me, her warm smile somehow easing the sharp corners inside me, if only for a moment. Other residents drifted through the corridors, some silently, some with stories etched into their faces. Stories of families who loved them once but forgot to keep loving. Sitting among them, I realized I was not alone in my pain. Each person carried their own version of abandonment, stitched into their hearts like unhealed scars. We shared quiet moments, sometimes a nod, sometimes a brief conversation, sometimes just sitting together in silence that understood more than words ever could. It wasn't home, but it wasn't entirely unbearable anymore. One afternoon, as I sat in the small garden behind the building, watching leaves tremble in the breeze, a man named Harold sat beside me. His hands shook with age, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "They brought you here recently, didn't they?" he asked gently. I nodded. He gave a soft, knowing smile. "Let me guess. They said it was better for you." I looked at him, surprised at how easily he had read the truth. He chuckled bitterly. "That's what they told all of us." His words settled deep inside me, not with pain, but with a strange sense of companionship. For the first time since I arrived, I didn't feel like the only person drowning under the weight of being unwanted. Over the next several days, I found myself speaking more, slowly, cautiously, sharing fragments of my story with others who shared theirs in return. Tales of children who promised to visit but rarely did. Tales of sons who once clung to their mothers but now clung only to their careers. Tales of daughters who once saw their fathers as heroes but now saw them as responsibilities. The building was full of people with hearts that had once been someone's whole world, now left sitting on these chairs, waiting for phone calls that never came and footsteps that never approached their doors. There was comfort in that shared sadness, not because it healed anything, but because it made the pain feel less like a personal failure, and more like a universal truth of growing old in a world that moves too fast to carry those who walk slowly. Then one day, as I was sitting by the window of the common room, watching the rain blur the world outside, My daughter appeared at the entrance. The moment I saw her, my heart jolted. Not with joy, not with anger, but with something I couldn't name. She looked fragile in a way I hadn't seen in years, her shoulders tense, her fingers twisting nervously as she approached. I felt my breath catch as she sat beside me, her eyes glossy with something dangerously close to pain. "Mom!" she whispered, her voice trembling. I waited, unsure what she had come to say. She took a long, shaky breath. "I'm sorry." The words fell between us like fragile glass, delicate and easily shattered. I stared at her, not because I didn't believe her, but because I didn't know how to hold such an apology. She continued, her voice cracking. "I don't know when I started losing sight of what mattered. I don't know how I let things get so far." She lifted her hands to her face, wiping tears she could no longer hold back. "I was tired. I was overwhelmed. And I made choices out of pressure, not love. But I never stopped loving you. Not for a single second." Her tears startled me because they were real, raw, painful, and utterly human. For weeks I had convinced myself she no longer cared. That she had moved on. That I had become invisible in her world. But now, sitting in front of me, she looked like the child I once knew. The child who turned to me whenever she was scared. Who believed I could fix anything. Her husband stood behind her, quieter than usual, his expression softer, apologetic. He approached slowly, his voice low. "I was wrong," he said simply. "And I'm sorry." The sincerity in his eyes disarmed me. I didn't know what to say. For a long moment I simply sat there, absorbing the weight of their words and the fragile hope they carried. My daughter reached for my hands, the same hands that once held her through every storm of her childhood, and this time she held them tightly, as if she feared letting go again. "Mom, come home," she whispered. "Please." My breath hitched, and for a moment the world around me blurred, not from tears alone, but from the overwhelming emotion that swept through me. I searched her face, looking for any hint of uncertainty, any shadow of hesitation. But all I found was a quiet desperation, a longing I had thought was lost forever. I realized then that love, though fragile, isn't always gone when it seems silent. Sometimes it waits, broken, bruised, buried, but still alive beneath the ash of misunderstandings and pressure. I squeezed her hands gently, feeling the warmth return between us like sunlight breaking through a long, stormy sky. I didn't say yes immediately. I didn't say no either. I simply held her, allowing the moment to breathe, allowing our hearts to remember each other. And in that fragile silence, I realized something powerful. Being loved doesn't always mean never being hurt. Sometimes it means giving those we love the chance to learn, to return, to rebuild. As she leaned her head on my shoulder, just like she used to when she was a child, I closed my eyes, letting the tears fall freely. Not from sadness, not from anger, but from relief. From the quiet awareness that maybe, after everything, I wasn't as forgotten as I feared. Maybe the bond between a mother and child doesn't disappear. It just gets lost sometimes, waiting to be found again. And in that moment, sitting in that quiet room with rain tapping gently against the window, I whispered to myself the truth I had almost forgotten. Even the heaviest hearts can find their way back to love.